Can it be seen, madam?
Yes, yes, can see.
Very good, very good. We'll make it large also, fit slide. Very big, big. So, hi. Last week, what did we do? Last week, we looked at what did we do? Yeah, we looked at Gaudi and the Italian futurists, right? That's what we did last time. And we are going to continue for a while to be in Europe, because Europe was really a place where a lot of the ideas that affected the modern, our modern kinds of, especially our culture and architecture, they really kind of grew at that time in Europe. Also, the war really affected a lot of cultural practices. So there was a lot of turmoil and new inventions that did happen in Europe at that time. Right? And this is Europe. We've already seen some of these. We've seen the arts and crafts style that was in London. We looked at the Art Nouveau, the Jugend style we haven't looked at yet. We will come to that. The Vienna Secession. We looked at the Liberty style and its reaction, which was the Futurists, and we looked at the Catalan Modernismo, which is of course Gaudi. This week we are going to go up north to the Netherlands, and we're going to look at what is called the Amsterdam School first, and then from there we'll be moving to another movement that almost ran parallel to the Amsterdam School, a movement that's called the Style or the Style. Right? I don't know whether you guys know much about Amsterdam, but the Netherlands is right up here. This is the the British Islands, and across is the Netherlands. Up here, it's a very, 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 very tiny country that used to be much tinier. If you look at the map of the Netherlands on the left of the 1300s, you realize that actually most of it is like water and it's very, very low lying. But by today, what has happened is that a lot of this land that was very low lying, in fact, a lot of Amsterdam continues to be actually below sea level. Netherlands continues to be below sea level. Is you have this entire kind of country is now kind of been reclaimed. So you have these kind of older technologies. I'm sure you've seen these images of the windmills of the Netherlands, the poppy fields, where of course lots of Yash Chopra films are shot. Tulips, sorry, not poppies. Tulip fields where all these Yash Chopra films are shot. And all these picturesque imaginations are not really natural. In many ways, they are all engineered. So the Netherlands is an incredible example of a landscape that is constructed almost entirely by man's interventions. Nature itself has been produced, manufactured, as it were. And because of that, and the way that it's been done is that these extremely large infrastructure projects have happened. Like these large 30-kilometer long roads that work as dams, and help in reclaiming land. These enormous sorts of infrastructure projects to protect the city of Rotterdam from flooding, because when it floods, the entire country almost can be destroyed. And even artificial beaches that are made that work as sort of ways in which uh, to handle the tides, actually, in many ways. And it is this really tiny little speck on earth that you're seeing right here, tiny little thing, that was one of the most important colonialists. It spread its colonies all over the world, from South America to South Africa, to of course the kinds of to Asia, to Southeast Asia. Hmm? Uh, and I don't know whether you guys know, but of course they also had small little colonies in India. Like Cochin, for example, has had a Dutch town for many years. Hmm?
Surat also.
So this tiny little country is spreading its wings all over the world, and is of course becoming very, very rich because of it. And Amsterdam as a city really becomes the center from where a lot of these boats leave, boats arrive, goods come, goods leave. So Amsterdam then becomes a really important international trading center. And this is the city of Amsterdam. Like I've already said, almost all of the Netherlands itself is reclaimed, and Amsterdam too lies on a very kind of clear network of canals. So everything that you're seeing in blue here are canals. This at the heart is the old city of Amsterdam, and the city has grown in rings around that, first more organically and later with much more planned developments, like if you're seeing here, that reach out, and you see the older fort wall that once used to be there with its moat that surrounds it. Yeah. Amsterdam, of course, is an extremely beautiful town. It lies on very soft soil. So even if you look at some of these buildings, because it's all aqueous, right? You'll realize that some of these buildings are actually teda. They are not vertical. In fact, Amsterdam is notorious for having buildings that are all wonky in nature. But there's also a great deal of possibility for building with brick. So brick becomes a really important material for this region. And it is that brick that leads to the style of architecture, highly influential style of architecture that is called the Amsterdam School. Now, the Amsterdam School actually emerges in the early part of the 20th century. But really, one of the main sorts of patrons who is not really officially a part of the Amsterdam School, I think he is actually, is a man called Hendrik Petrus Berlage. And this Berlage is this kind of really important sort of, one of those characters in architectural history who work as the sort of one of the most important influencers of modern architecture. So this is Berlage. He is considered, like I said earlier, the father of modern architecture. We always like having fathers in architecture and nation building. And in many ways, it was his work that really sort of formed a bridge between kind of conventional old imaginations of architecture that were prevalent at the time and a move into modernism or modernity that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Berlage himself was highly influenced by this particular writer, a German architect and art critic called Gottfried Semper. Now, Semper was an architect and built these sorts of buildings, but there was a book that he wrote in the 1800s that was called The Four Elements of Architecture. This book was very influential in really thinking it's one of those attempts to try and find what is the fundamental elements of architecture. Okay. Semper's work itself, is whatever, this is a building that he's done in Vienna in the Ringstrasse. If you remember, the Ringstrasse was the place where the Vienna Secession building was drawn. I don't know whether you remember that presentation, but with the Ringstrasse is the place where after the old walls were demolished, a new road was built in the 1850s, and that's where Semper builds this building. But what's more interesting is actually the book itself, The Four Elements of Architecture. And what he does in this book is that he, again, like so many people, is trying to discover what are the fundamental elements of architecture. If you remove all the fluff, if you have to come to the most core values or the things that make architecture, what are they? And he says that there are actually four. There's the hearth, which is the heart of the entire building. There's the enclosure, which is the skin of the building. The mound, which is the kind of plinth in many ways, and that is that you're sitting on. And there is the roof that actually protects you from the outside. So there is almost a mystical imagination in the way that he's thinking about architecture. He's reducing architecture to its most primitive forms, imagining that there are people centered around the hearth, okay, covered with the roof, and there's a skin that is woven literally around them. And you see the way that the skin is, even the way he's drawing, you see the kind of fact that even the roof as well as the walls around it are literally woven together. And when one thinks about even the later work of the Amsterdam School, you can see the way that the brick itself is used almost like a fabric that literally wraps around the main heart of the building. But what about Berlage's work? This, for example, is work that he does. You can see the extensive use of bricks and color, like actually that strange yellow roof. This is a small house that he made early in his career in 1898. Berlage, by the way, continues across for a long time. He even becomes part of SIAM. SIAM is an important modernist architectural movement. We'll arrive upon that a little later on, very influential with Le Corbusier. So he becomes literally this kind of man that everybody says, "Haan, Berlage ko to bulana padega." He's one of those really senior architects. And you see the inside where brick is being used structurally to create these sorts of grotto-like spaces. There are surfaces that are ornamental, that are all over the place. But perhaps his most largest and most influential building is this one, which is the Beurs van Berlage. That's what it's called now. It used to be the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It's an enormous building that is literally like a 2-minute to 3-minute walk directly outside Amsterdam's main railway station. Here you're able to see the fact that again it's built in brick. It's muscular, it's heavy, it sits on the ground. It kind of has all the details, etc., are emerging from the idea of the masonry. There's of course the ornamentation exists, but it's a sort of primitivist. It's not like overly ornate like you would in let's say the Semper building that we saw earlier. It's a very different sort of language of architecture. The inside has these enormous spaces which were used for the stock exchange. Right now it is used as a sort of general community center, etc. I have never been inside it. I think Shirish, you might have been inside it, but it's quite a beautiful. It's an extremely beautiful interior space.
No, I've not I've not been inside.
Yeah, but it's difficult to miss. It's directly on the main street. Even I could never go in. Yeah. Another image of the inside. Some of these elements are new, obviously, that have been fit in there so that the space can be used for concerts and things like that. And that's the roof. From the outside, this is the entire length of the building. There are 2 large rooms that we will see in the plan later on, and the corner has this long tower that marks the corner, and there's a big public square here. You can enter from this space, from this facade, into that long tower. So this is the plan. Yeah, you see the two large halls that are there. This is the entrance. You kind of come inside the lobby space. Simple plan with bays of smaller offices that exist on both sides, and you have otherwise large rooms that are broken up by this central lobby space that also works as a secondary lobby to go up with a staircase and lifts and things like that are at the heart of it. You'll see that in the section as well. 2 different kinds of roofs over those 2 large spaces. The central kind of open space that's there. The cross section again, you are able to see the tower on the edge, and the buildings. But what's interesting here is, of course, the use of brick. The use of brick and brick as a sort of surface, like a texture, like a fabric that literally wraps all around the building. Yeah. A drawing of the master plan. The axonometric. Actually, this is from the website of the Beurs van Berlage. It also has these images, right? These images that you can see from buildings from the Art Nouveau, where the surface of buildings itself becomes a way to really talk about the value systems that are important for that particular society, whether that's in written form or very often in the form of sculptural ornament that is then like friezes that are then placed on the surface of buildings. This is all happening literally very, very early in Amsterdam. This is happening in 1903, and this gets completed. In 1915, an interesting thing happens. Now, what is happening in 1915 in Europe? Europe is in the middle of a war, and the Netherlands actually does not take part in the war. It stays out of it. And what it does with the money that it has, rather than kind of spending it buying weapons and killing other people, it decides to build public housing. It's quite an incredible thing for a city to do at that time. I think it may be one of the first large-scale public housing projects done around the world. So you have, and Berlage is quite senior. He's asked to design the master plan for this new housing. So the old city of Amsterdam is up here, and this is plan Zuid. Zuid is south, so it's south plan, and this is the way that the entire area is planned. The plan actually follows a similar imaginations that you would see maybe when you are in what are called the Baroque imaginations of town planning. You have large axes, primary streets, secondary streets, right? Tertiary streets, blocks that are very clear, but you also have, and you have central axis, which has the main institutional buildings that are placed on the main public realms, and you can make that out. But what you have here are these blocks that are used to form the streets. The blocks are right on the edge of the street, so that the rear is open for community spaces and public spaces that are there at the back. That we saw a similar sort of thing even happening in the city of Barcelona, if you remember. But the Barcelona block with its perimeter being filled in, and the backs of these buildings being completely full of, whatever, community spaces, gardens, little small farms, things like that. So this became the sites, and this was only one of the plans. There were many such plans that were made. And these plans became a place where a lot of cooperative housing societies emerged that were built by workers. So there were new organizational systems that emerged in Amsterdam at that time, which were worker driven. Workers collectives emerged, and the government was in many ways supportive of these workers collectives coming together and helping them create housing. I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, where workers collectives are coming together to make their own housing, right? And this is an example. We'll come to an architectural, like a building that actually happens in this area. Again, you're able to see it much more clearly. The perimeter block with the backyards that are all there at the back, the institutional buildings on the edge, and you know, the street edge is formed by the building itself. You can see that in a view here too. Very simple, and actually in many ways very effective. So there was an act passed in 1901 that was called the Woningwet. I mean, I may be pronouncing all of that completely wrong. But the state, and this idea that a housing association can do self-development and can be the landlord and is in charge of absolutely everything that happens in that society, is an important institutional invention at that time. And a lot of these lands that were created by this act, including Plan Zuid, you know, became spaces for a lot of interesting architectural experimentation concerning housing. And it is here in that sort of environment that this particular school, that's called the Amsterdam School, emerges. What's interesting about the Amsterdam School is that it all seems to converge on an architect whose name was Edward Cuypers. Okay. Now, Cuypers was not an Amsterdam School architect at all. He was a fairly straightforward, you know, making those traditional buildings. But it is in his office that three of the most important people who then became proponents of the Amsterdam School worked, and they were all friends at that time. So that's Cuypers in the center, and surrounding him are lots of members of the Amsterdam School. And some of the main ones whose work we will all see is, there's one called Michel de Klerk, Van der Mee, and Piet Kramer. What happened is actually Van der Meer got a commission to make a building in 1928 or so, which was called the Shipping House. And rather than do it alone, he decided to work with his friends, de Klerk and Kramer, to come up with whatever they were playing with. And that is a building that becomes a really important building for the Amsterdam School. It takes some time developing, but here you can see the building itself. You can see the fact that it is along the water. Well, a lot of Amsterdam is along the water, but it's also along a harbor, and you have it evoking the shape of a ship with its turret and its like windows, right? It's sort of even its form, and it's kind of really kind of sharpened corner. And around this entire thing is lots and lots of kind of ornamentation and ornate stuff, right? And many of these images are celebrating the Dutch colonial empire, the entire empire that we saw a little earlier. And you have, for example, this, I think it says Indonesia, Indian Ocean. I think it says Indian Ocean. So you have these figurines that are really talking about the extent of Dutch power and Dutch influence all over the world. And of course, it's made in these brick, but you can see the way that the brick is being used, not so much structurally, but it's used actually almost as a surface. And you have terracotta, or rather being used also for a lot of the details that you're seeing on the surface. So besides, you have the 7 oceans and you have all of these things. When you come inside, you have this large interior space that is there at the center, which has this, you know, like the map of the world that you're seeing here in glass. In a certain way, you have a ship-shaped kind of light fitting, and of course here is where you are also able to see the influence of a movement like Art Nouveau, very much apparent in these sorts of details. This is the main entranceway at the prow. It literally looks like the scales of a fish or some sort of mermaid situation happening. These look like seaweed all entangled in the spears. This looks like Aquaman spear, for God's sake. No, it has that sort of imagination there. You know? And I love the way that the brick and the concrete meet. Look at the way that these entire notches are made. So there's a lot of attention to materiality itself and the way one material sits with another, what are the joints that are being made, and what is the imagination that it's evoking? What does it represent? Besides what it is, what it appears to be. The bridge designed by the mayor, which I just don't want to I won't get into it, but again, you can look at the form of it now. It's very unusual, muscular, using brick again to make the surface. But the architect who becomes most famous of all of the Amsterdam School people is this man called Michel de Klerk. He died quite young. And he is one of the main people whom they say is an important character in the story of what is called Amsterdam Expressionism, this idea of expressionism. We will really think about what that word means next week when we look at the Germans. But it's nice to kind of look at Michel de Klerk's work right now and look at the sort of work that he did in one of those sort of very, housing blocks that were built by and for supported by the state supported by the state, but the clients in many ways were workers' communities. This is a large site plan where he designed this entire square, these two buildings that are on this public square. Okay, I'm not being able to pronounce any of these names, so I'm going to just like say Spandam. I have no idea how to say that, but whatever. And he also designed this building, which is this corner building, which ended up being called the Ship. And this is the famous building that I love very much, which I think Shirish, you've gone and seen as well when you're in Amsterdam. Anytime anybody goes to Amsterdam, I say, go to the Ship, because it's not a building, and a lot of people know. People go and see like the style stuff and the modernist stuff. And this anyway, actually, I think what happened is that the Amsterdam School was considered unfashionable for most of the 20th century. From the 1920s to the 1980s, I think people were thinking, yeah, put our old-fashioned nonsense. I think only in the 1990s that there was a revival again of the interest in the Amsterdam School. Not only for
I think in the revival is also in the kind of sort of when postmodern kind of tendencies take over, we start looking at it again. Otherwise, it is relegated as decoration, mostly, and decoration is my God, terrible, right? So,
So I'm going to show you some images from these buildings. I'm going to show a lot of images because just like that's all. I mean, it's not too. It's just lovely. It's just lovely to see that big garden that lies in between these two blocks. Okay, it's just like a garden, lush garden, but you can see the kind of brick facades that are there on the surface. But if you go close to the brick facades, you see the fact that these facades are not very dead. They're full of these. They are full of different colored tiles and bricks. There are different sizes of bricks that are played with, different even colors of brick. The surface of the skin is like fabric. It is taut. It's like a fabric that's been taut and then cut and twisted and turned. And the brick, in many ways, even though it may be laid flat, gives the impression of movement. That is very much part of the way that the Amsterdam School works. Look at the way, for example, that this little tower sits on this tree. It becomes like a kind of spire that holds it up. These are older images of the buildings. Here the buildings are very straightforward. There are blocks of housing that lie, and in between the staircase towers are the towers where the entrances are in many ways detailed and decorated. The back of the building is not as muscular as the external. The back has balconies that overlook the backyards of the building. Old images of the street. You're able to see the old tile work. The details have almost stayed exactly the same across that whole era. The plan, like I said, is very straightforward. Little staircase block, flat, staircase block, flat, not at all. Yeah. But that's actually this block. But then, sorry, anyway. The other thing, the other block on the other side. So while this was this block. This block is different because it has a corner and an acute corner, very much as part of the project. So what he does is that he then makes a plan that emphasizes that corner. So what happens is that same building that otherwise was wearing dhar with that with a similar sort of flat that was there at the end that went across, the corner then starts becoming an expression of the corner. It begins to express the fact I am a corner. And again, along that axis, you find the flats change, but other flats stay the same. And in the middle, you have like, some sort of movements that are there, like the staircase blocks that are rising up. Yeah. This is the image of the corner. The corner then is look at the way that the windows work, for example. The windows are following a fairly straightforward rhythm, but also eccentric, because over here they're rectangles, over here the upper ka become like, some new thing. This becomes another kind of image. There's a like little circular turret here, something going up there. And look at the fact of these windows where this heavy corner makes this whole corner. These windows literally sit on that corner. And then this entire edge, the windows that are broken up, so you get a feeling of the vertical spire that happens towards the corner, and a little balcony that you can open out on. Another image of the same block, the second block. And this is the block as it stands today. And look at also the way that the materials change from the brick to the tile work to the brick to it goes on like that. Of course, the sweetness is of course in a lot of the ornament. Now, what's interesting here is the fact that all of this is workers' housing. In other words, it is Mara housing, to put it in another way. And it's very often seen that if you look at kind of low-income housing or workers' housing, the attention is to say that, okay, no, this is only housing for poor people. We need to save as much money as possible. So what happens is that any kind of flourish, any kind of ornament, any kind of storytelling that this building is involved in is completely denied. What we have instead are buildings that are completely blank, simple, almost dumb buildings. And it is imagined that it isn't that pure, and we of course justify that dumbness by saying, oh, it is pure, it is crystalline in nature, it has no ornament, because ornament is crime, that entire idea that we had from Adolf Loos from last semester. Instead, these buildings don't say that. Buildings take it and say that we should celebrate every life. We should celebrate a worker's life. We should make even these simple materials like brick and stone, we should make them tell stories. We should allow them to express the identities of the workers, so that the workers are not living in kind of dumb, boring places, but the workers are asked to celebrate their lives. More images from that. Look at this gorgeous, strange end, where this kind of railing comes up, this stairs, and then that kind of swoops outwards, as if like literally there are some, look at that corner, right? It swoops outwards and holds that drum that's there on top. That cylinder that's there on top. But the highlight of that entire ensemble, if you want to call it, is this building that is called the Ship, because it looks like a ship. It's designed by Michel de Klerk again, okay, and the housing organization was called Eigenhard. Eigenhard, I don't know if you can read it. That is, the Ship is this building, okay, and that tower that you're seeing is here, okay, at this corner. I'll show you some more images of it. Sorry, we have to go back to the Ship. This is the plan. Now, this building here is actually not designed by de Klerk. Some of these buildings are not designed by de Klerk, but of course the entire square is completed because of the way that the buildings are planned. That's the master plan, a tiny little corner. So that's the tower at the back that overlooks this central green space. And you have a low building that is there at the corner. Very unusual thing to do, to go low at the corner. And the low corner is actually a place for the post office building. That's the post office really at that time in the early 1920s or so, the post office is really an important kind of community space for people. It also is the place that says that I am here, that gives you address, that gives you identity. So it is the post office that actually takes pride of place on the external corner, and the inside, I believe, is a community hall with a tower that's there above. This is the plan of the building at the corner of this edge, right? And here you're seeing the way that different house typologies are, flat typologies are created. So you have, for example, N, these are all the same that run across. Then suddenly they change into different house types along that corner to make that strange dent of an entrance courtyard within the external wall. And this corner is also made up by different house types that run across. This building is not designed by de Klerk, but everything else kind of moves around with that. This is from the corner. The other two sort of buildings that he's done are here and behind me. This is the post office building. You can see the tower at the back through here, and these are the two walls of buildings that exist on both sides. Come closer, and that's the entrance, and you can see why it's called the ship actually. Yeah, it's called a ship because of of course, its form, the way that the windows work, the fact that there's a constant attempt to emphasize the horizontality or the movement of the ship. You see that in the way that the proportions work. A lot of times when we build facades, we always like put one line here, one line here, one line here, and it has equal. But there's very clearly an attempt to consolidate the inside into larger surfaces that can then express the external movement of the building. You have that tower on the edge with the clock against it. This is the main entrance. You enter here, and that's how you enter the central space, and you walk along. You'll see more images. So I won't spend too much time here. Oh, so this is a quotation from de Klerk, for example. Nothing is too good for the worker who has to do without beauty for so long. And that is one of the reasons why I like this building so much. I like this building because it is unashamed of the fact that architecture is about making people's lives better, making it richer, making it more valuable. And beauty is a really important human aspiration. So it really embraces the imagination of beauty, of textures and of sculpture and of playfulness, and creates this building. More images of the building. There are too many images that are repeating themselves, but damn, just imagine you guys are there, standing outside. Main entrance, you come inside the tower. Look at the surface change again, the detail here. It's very nice to look at the details when you kind of go close, spend some time with it and look at the way that every single window and every single corner is very carefully detailed out. It's difficult to describe in photographs, but it's important to learn that there is no such thing as just a wall. Such a thing doesn't exist. There's no such thing as just a window. There's no such a thing as just a corner. There is a constant attempt to make every single square inch of this building alive with beauty. Older drawings of the building. What's interesting is these long lines, the attempt to kind of emphasize the horizontality, pretty much like Frank Lloyd Wright does in the Robie House, which, by the way, Frank Lloyd Wright had done an exhibition, and Frank Lloyd Wright's work was well published in the Netherlands. So there must have been a sort of two-way conversation between Wright and de Klerk concerning these buildings. This is the rear building, the tower, and the strange dent courtyard that lies at the back. I'll show you some of these strange eyelid windows that also happen, like they're little eyes in the wall. Older photograph of the tower, and this is the way that the post office is on the left, and this is the way that the windows kind of go. Look at what's happening here. It's crazy stuff. The windows folding in, up, out, inwards, right? It's three-dimensional. This is not a window punched into a wall. Imagine the making of this window. This making of the window is you take this surface, you create another folded surface on top of it, within which you then put a window. So there's literally a sort of sculptural way in which there's a movement that's being expressed within this architecture, a dynamic that is being expressed within this architecture. Another image of that edge. Look at the colors of brick constantly change. This is vertical, that is horizontal. This is a story of textures and details. These are those horizontal lines that you're seeing that are running across the whole surface to emphasize the horizontality. The brick textures change over here, over here, over here. You get these windows that are like, I don't know, like two eyes with a nose in the middle that's placed here. You have this tower that swoops out from the surface and kind of rises up to create a sort of Gaudi-esque, if you want to put it that way. If you remember Casa Mia's roof, a Gaudi-esque roofscape. I love this stuff. Look at this. Look at the details that join the building that he didn't design to the building that he did design. This building that comes like folding with these things, turns around, goes back. Cute little windows that are looking at this place like a little elephant looking at something that's happening here. That surface coming, turning back so that this surface kind of can be felt. This surface that happens on the outside of this wall, turning around, holding back and pushing it down to wrap it, hold it. Yeah. Images of the same, that wild corner. The building itself literally seems like it kind of is supple and moving like it's made of clay. It has that sort of feeling, and because it's brick, that feeling that it's this sort of soft, that has softness is emphasized. Look at this window again, that eyelid, karke, sneaking up and down. And there is a sort of randomness and a playfulness around it, which is nice. There's no idea that everything has to look the same and be the same. This is workers' housing that really allows individual identities for every apartment. No, like my window may be different from my neighbor's window. It doesn't all have to be the same. This corner, I don't know, what could you call this?
Juxtaposition.
I have no idea.
Juxtaposition. Yeah.
And look at this window. Can you imagine sitting in this window here? Yeah. Tiny little space with this glass on all sides. Another window here, another window. These rooms must be so cute, actually, in many ways. Huh? And the way that corners, of course, work. Below that entire capsule, this is the detailing. And there are these lovely little kind of square, kind of ornamental pieces that are there across the entire surface. The tower itself, this is an inside view of the tower. It's actually nothing happens in there. There's a wooden substructure, and it's like a expressive sort of idea that I am a neighborhood building. I am an important building. This is the dent. I keep calling it the dent. There are two houses that you enter underneath this dent, and there's a way that you kind of rise up into this. The apartment that they have, a show apartment. This is now a museum as well. That is here. At the look at that. Yeah. So that's the inner courtyard, the large community hall, and I think it's a community hall. I may be wrong. I think it's a meeting hall. Yeah, I think it's a meeting hall. This is the meeting hall in the rear courtyard. You see the tower at the back, and some more details of the outside. I'll take you inside soon. The windows, the brackets, and like look at this now, half purple, half red brick. Yeah. Fun. And terracotta brick itself is used sculpturally across the entire surface. Love this one where the window doesn't exist horizontally on the same plane. The window turns at another plane only. And this is by the way, the numbers of the rooms, etc. happen inside here. So there's a you remember that word that we've been using for quite a while, what they call the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. It's a little like that, Gesamtkunstwerk. Every single square inch of this building is creating a total work of art within which one is living. This is the inside, even the inside. This is the inside of the post office actually. Even the inside, this is I think the telephone booth. This thing and all the details. Look at, I love this little handle. There's a hand holding a handle thing. Andar aajo, I'm not allowing you in, I'll open it. Like it's as if a guard is standing there holding the door saying, Acha, you're coming in, I'll open it for you. That's the one. That's the door that comes in. There's a little kind of area at the back where you wait. And everything is built into the furniture itself. This is the model apartment that they have, and the interior of the model apartment full of these sort of interiors that probably existed at the time this place was being built. The spires and the font, of course, also designed. Gesamtkunstwerk and the tower. Enough of this building, no? So Michel de Klerk, of course, was also very, very important at that time because he was evolving a new kind of architectural language. And if you guys remember, oh no, it was in the third year that we spoke, third year that we spoke about the 1925 exhibition that happened in Paris. So 1925, there was a big important exhibition that happened in Paris that was called, interestingly, it was called I'm not going to read this is La Art Hollandaise Exposition International des Arts Decorative, whatever. But the word Art Deco actually emerges from the name of this exhibition. Because in this exhibition, there was a lot of the work that was displayed was this highly decorative, beautiful, ornamental storytelling work. And de Klerk designed a Dutch pavilion for that particular project, for that particular thing. And here you can see the external view of it. You see again the evocation of sorts of traditional structures, almost Mayan imaginations. Think about Frank Lloyd Wright also being inspired by Mayan ideas at this time. Also being inspired by the fact that actually the architectures that a lot that are being currently known by the Europeans is also based on a lot of the places that they've colonized. So there's a lot of new sorts of ideas concerning architecture that are being brought to the Netherlands and that are being used by architects decoratively, playfully to make buildings. I love the way that this entire brick facade floats over the ground, this deep shadow that happens. But we go to a project now where de Klerk worked with Piet Kramer, another one of the big kinds of people. Kramer had, I think, the longest career out of all of the Amsterdam School people. This lasted for quite a while. And here you have the external kind of wall, and these are some images of what is called the Dageraad housing complex. I'm not going to go into much detail here. I'm just going to show you some more images of the Amsterdam School. For more information, it's all available online, and even this presentation has a lot of text like this that you can read to know more about it, which I've kept on purpose just so that I don't need to read it. You all can read it later since it's going to be available online. But I love the way that this tower is created. This fold is coming in and that kind of thing rising up. The imagination, of course, is that this is workers' housing. So it's imagined like literally like the flags of workers waving in the wind. And that literally becomes the inspiration for this sort of tower, and that undulation of a surface like it's a flag that's waving in the wind. See the corner again, same sort of building. More images of this is the back. Again, similar sorts of mad, lovely ways in which the brick surfaces meet each other. Another project at the back of that building is this one by Michel de Klerk and Piet Kramer again. Look at the forms themselves of these buildings. They're imagined as little, I guess you could have been workers marching, dhad, like literally one after the other, all in a line. This is the building today with its way. Again, it meets the ground flat and then it begins to cant upwards. The corners between each of these have these little circular balconies that you're seeing here. Some drawings. I just wanted to show these drawings because of the fact that just like the way that the hand is moving across the surface of the buildings, it's fluid, it's shapely. They're using the hand because the hand allows you to make these sorts of fluidities. You can see the folds and the movement, which is why I'm showing these drawings. Another building by Kramer. I'm showing it because it's considered famous. I've never seen it, so I can't say much about it. This is in The Hague. A large department store that was designed by him. So at the same time, there's of course, this if this thing has to become a movement, it needs publications that are going to make it a movement. In 1818, a particular publication called Wendingen or Windings was created, and this became really the voice of the Dutch avant-garde, the place where the new Dutch movements were given a space to really talk about what they felt was important. And this, for example, is the first issue of Wendingen. And you see the cover, it's so ornamental. You can see its relationship with the Dutch Amsterdam School very much. Later on, this is also a cover of another magazine, and you see that it's a completely different language. It's coming from another idea of the modern entirely, the modern that we are more familiar with, the modernism of the Bauhaus and those kinds of movements. So as much as the Amsterdam School was doing its own sort of flourishing, making kind of working class housing, you have at the same time, and these are the sorts of ways, like this is Plan Zuid Headship in 1919, the Dageraad 1923, and Wendingen starts in 1918. You have almost at the same time another movement that becomes extremely important for the development of the Bauhaus and architecture that happens earlier. So Amsterdam literally, or the Netherlands really becomes an important center for architectural thought. You have this movement that's called De Stijl, D-E-S-T-I-J-L. And this is a movement that really is interested in thinking about what is the fundamental elements of architecture. Unlike the Amsterdam School, it is interested in saying we don't need all these decorations and things. We need to really think about what is the fundamental pure idea of architecture. And it is that we'll be looking at now. And the style in 1917, of course, wrote an important manifesto. We'll see some of the work that emerges later on, but let's just look at that manifesto itself. One of the most important characters in this is a man called Theo van Doesburg. Doesburg is one of the main guys who came up with the manifesto. So just very quickly saying, this Piet Mondrian is an artist that architects all love very much. But one of the things that you'll find about these particular guys is they are interested in abstraction. Taking life and removing all that is unnecessary so that all that you're left with are the fundamental elements of architecture, whatever that might be. Or fundamental ideas of painting, whatever that might be. Here's a little quote from Mondrian about neoplasticism. This movement was also called neoplasticism. It says the new plastic idea will ignore the particulars of appearance. Ignore the particulars of appearance, natural form and color. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color. That is to say, the straight line and the clearly defined primary color. So the idea is that if you remove everything, all that you're left with is color and line. And if you look at the work of Mondrian, of course, all these amazing paintings that are made, you'll realize that there is an attempt to take reality and reduce it down to its most fundamental elements, like this one. This is called Tableau, 1921, or this one, which is called Composition number 10, because it doesn't mean anything. It's just a composition, right? It has its own meaning. Or this very famous one that is called Victory Boogie Woogie, which is made much later in his career when he was in America, and it's supposed to be, I guess, a plan maybe of New York City. We have no idea. But Doesburg was one of the main characters, right? And he was really interested in trying to figure out what are the ways in which we can think about, and he was, of course, the main kind of theorist around it. He also moves to the Bauhaus in 1922. So there is a sort of exchange between the style imaginations and the Bauhaus imaginations that we will discover later. One of the most amusing things that I found about this whole story is okay, they were all interested in making these drawings, Mondrian and Doesburg. All of their drawings are these square, whatever, color. But one of the most important fights that they had was when Doesburg and Mondrian fought with each other, saying that Doesburg started using diagonal lines in his paintings. And Mondrian said the diagonal is not pure. Okay, therefore they had a fight and never spoke to each other. I find that whole thing quite entertainingly naive, but nevertheless, I guess these were things that were earth-shattering at that time. So anyway, this is a kind of cafe that is designed by Doesburg in 1926, the Café Laubette. Here you can see the way that, again, their primary colors that are all over the place, all these diagonals that are moving across surfaces that are there, the flooring patterns. They are literally like Mondrian paintings that have been put on that have been made three-dimensional. You can see this, and of course there's a kind of cascading color and line system that's very much part of it. Yeah, and for some reason the style becomes extremely important for a lot of us also who started learning architecture in 1989 in LS Raheja College of Architecture, because all our exercises were designed in a sort of style mode that we had to.
Whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, composition in line, color and shape, and you do the chip and put some color. Could never understand the logic of it, but well, it has a history, this kind of question. Nevertheless, this is the kind of stuff that happened. Great drawing, so I just thought I'll put the drawing, Doesburg's project for a university space. Okay. Another very important architect and actually furniture designer is Gerrit Rietveld. Right, this is one of the few real buildings that is built by the Dutch style. We keep talking about that the building is the most influential thing, but actually, if you think about it, the Italian futurists as well as these guys built very little compared to the influence that they've had. So it's a very strange sort of contradiction that we find. Even the Amsterdam School, actually, lots of architecture, but really, I mean, Amsterdam School definitely built much more than the style.
And they were involved in the entire public housing scene. So exactly. So the scales were far more larger.
I think only JJP out among these among the style people did any work concerning housing. Others, all of them are interested in these tiny things. One of the most important objects of the dust style is this thing. It's called the red and blue chair. That's the design of it. You can see the fact that it's probably extraordinarily uncomfortable, but it's elemental, but it's pure. It has all of those things happening. The little yellow corners that are there and the red planes. It's very interesting, actually. I mean, they're very beautiful objects if you see them. Really kind of stunning. This is again Rightweld doing a exhibition design, three-dimensionalizing almost the Mondrian imagination of simple lines and planes with colors. But this is the house that he's designed in the town of Utrecht, which I have never seen.
I've been there.
Is it?
I've been there. Yeah, but I couldn't go inside. I took a train, and just to see the house, I went. Shockingly small. Shockingly small, meaning like incredibly tiny. Cannot imagine. Yeah, but it looked quite stunning from the outside, at least. Exactly what this image is.
Yeah. So so this is the Rightweld house. It's a ground plus one structure. It's called the Schroeder house, Rightweld Schroeder house. It's an interesting plan, really interesting plan. This is the kind of ground level here. It's ulta for some reason, and this is the upper level. What you have here, it's better to look at this color drawing. When you come inside here, the lower level has all walls that all kind of separate all the service spaces, all the kind of studio space, kitchen space are all below. You take the stair that is right at the center of this plan and you go up. And once you're on top, okay, your entire space has all these sliding folding doors. So like this space becomes this space just because of all the sliding folding doors that are able to do that movement and kind of meet at the center. So it's a way in which, in the same way, an open office plan and an open plan and a kind of questions of privacy are handled by the sliding folding systems that are part of this plan. These are some images that you'll see. These are the tracks along which the doors move. This is the Uperka space with all the doors open. And look at the floor, red, black, blue. There's a compositional imagination where the vertical, horizontal furniture and walls, everything all kind of come together to form a larger whole. Again, another view of the inside. You can see the guy trying to move the wall, and yeah, so cute. You have the red and blue chair also placed there. Comfortable. The way that the corner disintegrates, there's no corner anymore. The corner is open completely with glass because now it's a composition with planes, So even look at this. Look at this. Interestingly, logically, this vertical member should have been at this corner, but no, it's not. It has been moved away from that corner, so you get the sense of the floating being emphasized by the floating plane. Sky. It's just really kind of three-dimensional sorts of composition, really, within the cube of all these surfaces going in and out. Extremely influential house. I would say that it really influences right up to Peter Eisenman's work very much later on in life. The architect that I spoke of a little earlier, J.J.P. Aud, is one of the only ones who actually builds social housing. And look at it, what's happening there. The clerk's headship is here. It's in the same year, almost, maybe a year later, that J.J.P. Aud becomes the architect for the housing of Rotterdam. He builds a lot of housing using very simple white box technique. So this is an entire master plan done by him. You can see the fact that although it follows in many ways the Amsterdam block, the external perimeter with the insides that are there, the architectonic language is substantially different from everything that you're seeing around it. All these red brick buildings, and you have these pure white cuboids within it. Low rise, not as tall as the others. And look at the way that the glass, etc., is also set in. It seems like they are not again following the logic of the plan. They're using kind of material itself to express the corners and things like that. We have this other images of the housing in Rotterdam. And this is a project that he did in 1927 and what was the Weissenhof Estates. We'll come to this extremely important moment in architecture that happened in Amsterdam in Stuttgart in 1927, but we'll do that maybe 2 weeks from now when we're looking at the new objectivities. Yeah. This is the housing again in Weissenhof. Simple dabba buildings, all the services at the back and front yards that are there. You come in front yard, enter the house, row housing, what they call row housing, pretty much. That's this. So that's about it actually in terms of both of these styles. I just wanted to kind of show you that this is what's happening within Amsterdam. These ideas will again mirror across other geographies, other places. Well, and just to kind of revise a little bit, this is, if you look at two of the most important buildings that were built week and a week before that, you have the Futurist Manifesto written in 1909, along with the Roby House, also in that same year. It's just happening in between the Berlach School as well as the Plan Zuid, and where in Barcelona, it's being built in 1914 by of course Gaudi, Antonio Gaudi. Okay, and it's actually also the same year. Sorry, it's also the same year. To move this year as the futurists that the Antonio Sant'Alia's drawings for the futurist city. So when I look at Sant'Alia's towers and movements and horizontals, and I look at the headship, I really think at that time this idea of movement and architecture is something that's not stable, but something that is part of a journey towards betterness, and how that is expressed through architectures themselves that are expressing movement become an important thing at that. That's all.
Yeah. Rohan, this is also the same time that that Vienna is also doing a lot of public housing work. So you have your Karl-Marx-Hof and Rabenhof and all these projects, which also have a similar kind of what do you say, aesthetic kind of decorativeness to them. The language is different, but there is an attempt at creating the surface in a certain way, in both those projects. And the fact that being public housing allowed them to create hybrid programs within the housing. Okay, so for example, which is there in Headship also, the post office and the other kind of amenities became a part of the entire sort of housing itself. So you find that in many European housing projects, which is not at all so in the American kind of public housing.
Not at all.
Not at all. Yeah.
Even actually, but I would say it's not even true of the housing projects done in England as much.
Not true. Not very little. The English housing projects have the idea of the shared kind of allotment lots at the backyard, which but they are private plots which are actually pooled together as a share in many ways. So they're not really okay.
Any comments, questions, any clarifications required? Any other things that came in your mind while you all were watching this? We didn't pick people, did we?
We didn't pick people, but there is a Ambika has asked a question. She's saying that did the style movement stimulate Le Corbusier's color theory as well?
It might have. The style actually, once we go back to once you tell the Corbusier story, there's no direct connection between the two, but there are many spaces where these characters tend to meet. It's a space of a great number of encounters. I think that at that point, if I'm not wrong, I think Villa Savoy should be around what, 1924, 27, something like that.
Yeah.
While I think the Schroeder House is what, 24? What is the date I had of that?
Right. Not. Let's see.
The Schroeder House is 24. Not bad. Huh? I'm getting better with numbers, guys. So yeah, don't laugh. Huh? But yeah, there are certain ideas that are doing the rounds. By that time, before Corbusier is even designing Villa Savoy, he has come up with, in 1915, if I'm not wrong, his idea of the domino house, which is the purified and simple kind of thing. And I think these ideas, I mean, Paris is not that far away from Amsterdam, so I'm sure that there was definitely a dialogue between these people, not that I have any specific knowledge of it.
No, but the exhibition must have played a big role, or the series of exhibitions from that period must have had a big influence. Whether they are art exhibitions or architecture and decorative art exhibitions, they must have played an influence for sure. Tanvi Daga has raised her hand.
Yeah, I was thinking about all this exposed brick work in Amsterdam. Is there a link between this and the other exposed bricks work in the world? For example, IIM and other Nadi Gandhi works.
That's a good question, actually. I mean, I'm not certain. Look, if you ask me at a philosophical level or at a theoretical level, I would say yes. Like, there is something about brick because it's made from the ground, because it has a certain kind of earthy color, that it evokes a certain kind of muscularity and heaviness. Very much so. And I think both, if you look at both the Amsterdam school as well as Louis Kahn, they both seem to draw upon the fact that it's made from the earth. But if I think about the way that both of them approach it, it's very, very, or let's even Nari Kahn, they all three of them approach it very differently, Like what the Amsterdam school is doing is using the brick literally as surface. It's playing with it. It's like, it's fluid, it's gentle, it's warping, it's all of these things. While with somebody like Khan, it is muscular, it's heavy, it's monumental. It doesn't have movement actually. It is anti-movement. It is as if it's permanent there, like a ruin. It lasts forever. While with somebody like Nari Gandhi, it is more a matter of local materials and local culture. So it's made in a different mode entirely. So I think materials are interesting because they allow you to express your own interests in a variety of different ways. But it's an interesting question that you've asked. It's just maybe an interesting thing to even think about, that how does a brick become many different things? How do brick surfaces take on different roles depending on what really one wants to explore?
It's interesting, that question, because I have actually been intrigued by so Rohan, I saw the headship first, and then we saw the Mayo Memorial, right, in Allahabad.
Right,
okay,
right.
And Mayo Memorial is at least 40 years before the headship. Okay,
Yeah.
and it has and I'll share the link to that building over here, but it has a similar kind of ornamentation in brick that we see in headship, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that there is the experimentation, whether it is philosophical or it is actual material kind of experiments, they have been there across the world in many places, and somehow they find consolidation in certain movements, especially in Europe at that time. So yeah. I see it as part of that continuous tradition of sort of continuous building traditions in that sense, and in that sense, Khan in some way falls in that line. Of course, the playfulness is not there. There is something else in it, but but his Khan's use of brick in IIM Ahmedabad and in his other buildings in the US is a little different. In the US, the buildings are clad with that brick. Fundamentally, they are less load bearing than.
In IIM, it's reinforced brick, huh?
Yeah, but fundamentally load bearing also, right?
Fundamentally load.
Yeah, fundamentally load bearing. So, okay. Anyone else?
Did you like the building? Just simple questions. Or did you think it was fun to watch them, or Ravan later, darling? Please let other people speak. We'll wait until one more person or two more people speak, then we'll get to you, Shravan. So it's in your interest that other people ask questions. Should we pick people?
Yeah.
Okay, I know whom to pick. Vatsal.
Right.
I met him in college last week.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, you exist even even online. Turn your camera on. Nice to see you faces. So tell us something. This is Vatsal. Right. Sitting on a white
seat. I found it very interesting that all the detailings and the brick facades that are there in Amsterdam, with all the colors that appear in my mind whenever I heard the word Amsterdam, with all the canals. I think that makes it beautiful city in some sense. All the ornamentation and the colors that we imagine that to be there, and again, doing that ornamentation for a public building is not what we even think about it in today's time. So that's what.
Yeah, it's something that like I was never trained to treat ornament seriously. I was trained to treat ornament as decoratively, always. It's just a thing, and maybe your generation will be different. I don't know. Especially now with digital technology so easily available and being able to create all kinds of forms. Last time there used to be an argument at a time when ornament is wasteful because we don't have the craftsmen. It takes a lot of time, etc., etc. Right? But now, it's just like one click of a button away, darling. So who knows what the future is? Are we going to have buildings that are actually going to be exuberant surfaces of just gorgeous details and screens, maybe? Where the entire building is made up of touchscreen kind of panels, maybe. I have no idea, but would be nice to kind of speculate what are the new materials and expressions that one can have for our contemporary time.
Yeah.
One more person. God, you guys are terrible.
I had a question. I mean, rather a view. So as Shirish mentioned that the brickwork and that the where you were talking about those that little space, the three windows, and that round thing was like a juxtaposition to the entire building, to the entire the straight walls. So and most of the brickwork that was done in these buildings and the corners, they were very different, so they were actually contrasting the entire building, and which was something very interesting. So can it be also be said as that the whole concept of this public housing was basically just juxtaposition to the war which was happening in other places, and so the people were ridden of their homes, and where in Amsterdam they were given homes. So yeah.
The architecture of public housing has always been one of the most difficult questions, really, because nobody wants to spend money on it. All the, if you look at the discourse concerning housing, especially low-income housing, most will be about cost. It won't be about life, and it won't be about anything else. It'll be about cost.
Yeah.
And it's nice to, and it's good to kind of think about another way of thinking about housing that doesn't consider only cost, that considers like the cost on people's lives rather than on cost of construction.
Yeah.
That's the reason why we are able to build public housing even in the city today that has only 3 meters between buildings that are 21 meters tall, because it was all about cost. I think to think about architecture as a way for communities to celebrate their own identities is nice to think about, where architecture is in a conversation with people, like just happy.
It has to also do with what we as architects see our role in this society, right? Do we see our role as serving a particular kind of client? Do we see the client as a community and a group of people? Do we see the city as our client and the sort of housing departments as our clients? Do we sort of do we want to be able to be in their service in some sense? I think these are all questions that that are fundamental to really thinking about what kind of architecture comes around us as well. Like who's building, who's actually fundamentally taking the decisions and responsibilities of what has been built and things like that. Although there are experiments in public housing in India also, where for example, Charles Correa has done public housing, and some of it is quite what do you say, quite joyous and
generous.
Yeah, exactly.
Generous not maybe in terms of area, but generous in terms of imagination.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like you can have really large buildings that can be very not generous also.
Yeah.
This is generous in the way that imagine, yeah, look, karenge, na, it's fine. That's how they are. Little bit like that.
The other area where public housing has really sort of had a presence is in the company town housing, and where also architects have played an important role. Like for example, your Bata housing or your what is it called? IFCO housing and all, large kind of company housing. Recently, these guys did a housing apna. Okay, then this one they did a housing for another company, remember?
Yeah.
Public housing. I mean, in that sense, it's a public, but for a set of company
Yes.
kind of employees.
Anyone else, or we can get Mr. Shravan Iyengar in?
Yeah.
Shravan Iyengar.
Namya has shared something, but it's a video, public media art vision. I'm not.
Well, there's
Watch it.
other people have to say have said things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of chat.
Yeah,
happening.
there's a lot of chat happening. Okay, great. Fleur says Amsterdam was already ahead by building public housing during the war. Wow. Okay, and she gets 4 thumbs. All right, and I shared the Mayo Memorial for their reference. Vaishnavi says the row houses of Amsterdam reminds me of those lane houses of San Francisco. They are different in their own ways, but their facades have similarities. Yes. Yes. If you go to many American cities, there is an Amsterdam Avenue in those cities. Okay, and you will find that there are similar kind of housing sort of typologies in many of the American cities, especially on the coasts. Yeah, primarily because there was Dutch presence in New York. Okay, maybe New York only.
New York
But
was
also,
first a Dutch city.
Yeah.
It was then made into this city. New York was made by the Dutch first.
Yeah.
It was New Amsterdam before it became New York.
Yeah. So you definitely have the influences in American cities as well.
I don't know whether you find this sort of glorious brick ornamentation though.
In New York?
In New York, maybe in Brooklyn you do actually. I think I've seen some.
You
rows.
do.
Yeah.
You do. I mean, the older parts of even Upper Harlem has some. But of course, New York is also reconstructed many times. Huh?
Yeah.
I mean, there are parts of New York that have been burnt in fire and then reimagined, things like that. So Brooklyn, yes, for sure. Okay, what is the next one? Next one. Namya, what were you trying to show? If you can
tell us what it is.
Tell us.
Yeah, actually, it's just a video that I found. So the whole facade of this building is actually projectors. So it was quite interesting on how we were talking from brick facades to like literally moving into projection facades.
Nice. Nice.
Shravan?
I'm on. Okay. I have two like things to say. One's a question, one's a comment. Can I do both, or do I have time for one?
Both.
Okay. So firstly, I wanted to say that it's really like interesting how when we talk about the ornate design of like the public housing in the ship versus like Schroeder House, which is less ornate and it's more about its abstraction. The ornate structure actually has to do very less. It's a very passive act for it to kind of engage in like these kind of intricacies. While if you look at Schroeder House, like the idea of it is so simple that it actually like has to use these elements in such a chaotic way. Like it actually has to try hard to kind of I mean, I'm not saying in a bad way. Like you can actually see like kind of the exuberance. Like so when we talk about ornate architecture, it's interesting how the ornate architecture is actually very subtle compared to like the less ornate modernist architecture, which really tries hard to kind of go on. Actually, that was not a question. That was a comment.
No, it's a good point. That what is ornament and what is not? That is a question. Like what point does when you're eating food? Let's put it this way. Does it become about just nutrition, and at what point does it become about flavor?
Yeah.
Is flavor ornament or is flavor necessary for nutrition? I have no idea.
But it has I think it has to also do with the process of creation, right? I mean, in Schroeder House, for example, the architect is largely sort of responsible for creating all the decorations. Okay. But when it came to an earlier kind of period, the architect actually was very closely working with those who were sculptors and people who were going to actually create the ornamentations, I think. So for example, I'm just thinking of the Masa Satiputta buildings, right, which have which have on it kind of Art Deco sort of relief work on the buildings. They work very closely with artists who were commissioned to do those ornamentations, you know, and so the building facade created the space for the artists to actually create the ornaments. Same goes with your VT station sort of ornamentations as well, right? So you had the entire sort of, in many ways, the discipline of architecture was much more sort of complex or diverse, I would say, and we find that getting a little bit more streamlined as we proceed later. Yeah, that's my response to Sharon.
What's your question now, sir?
No, that was supposed to be my question, but I turned into a comment actually.
Okay.
I think another comment I had is like, so we did a school project for UMind on Dutch architecture actually. Surprisingly, it wasn't my subject. Someone who wasn't into architecture kind of took it. And we were kind of, you know, trying to compare Powai's like kind of architecture, like the Dutch inspiration it had. But now that I'm actually looking at this kind of Dutch architecture, like Powai seems very facial, you know. And I'm kind of kicking myself for not going on the trip because I had very stupid reasons to not go for that my trip. Because of all this, like, and it's like we kind of, you know, I don't know, I'm just like, it's a comment. Like, I thought Powai architecture, like, at least had some, even though it was very, like, kind of plastered on, there was still, like, some sort of Dutch inspiration from it.
Was that Dutch inspiration?
In Dutch, or yeah?
I never thought of the Powai buildings as having any Dutch sort of influences.
Like, Granandani part has, like, a claim, I don't know, there are claims that it's kind of...
See, with Granandani, everything is Dutch or English or European or Venice. Nothing is real. So everything is mere time pass. You can call it anything. Okay. So the idea, it's not Dutch. It is some idea of Europeanness that we can call Dutch. It has nothing to do with actually the architecture of the Netherlands whatsoever, really.
Yeah, it was kind of a very like stuck on.
Yeah. It's just making housing into a commodity that the middle classes can aspire to be European through. Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And therefore, it is the kind of Europe that the Indian middle classes think Europe is. It has nothing to do with real Europe. It is the image of Europe that is being plastered on. That's all.
Rohan, it's interesting that we are doing lectures in third year where we are talking about something and we are talking about something else over here. It's
Yes.
You know, and yeah, because then because then the question that I can ask is what's wrong with that? But I'm not going to ask that question right now.
Yeah. I'm just saying that that's what aspirations are.
Yeah.
Aspirations are very strange things. I think that
should I share the video if I find it? I think our video
it's not about whether this is better or worse. It's just to say that this is where it's coming from. Now you can decide what you want to do with it.
But I think I have a nice purpose really.
Indian middle classes have a deep desire to not be in India. It's like a thing. If anyone had their way, they would all escape to the United States of America and live in a single family suburban bungalow with a backyard and a front yard and a dog.
And a car in front.
And a car, yeah, of course. That is what everyone, the Indian middle classes would like to do. None of them really want to be in India. So which is one of the main commodities that is sold as housing within India. Okay, which are all the names of all the class aspirant buildings are Altamonte or Palladio or Michelangelo or something fancy like that. Once upon a time, buildings used to be called Sai Shriddhi and all. You know? Now they are nothing like that.
Sai Shriddhi.
Now they're all very fancy. All of them.
Now they're called W54, W13, and B4, like you know.
And
West Side.
And you know that Andheri no longer exists. Andheri
what is it?
Upper Juhu or something like that.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that. Do you know where